بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله هو الذي أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق. الله تبارك وتعالى يتحمل الدعوة ويحمي الدعوة، فنحن لا نقلق على الدعوة من هذا الجانب، ولكن نقلق على أنفسنا ونقلق على التدمير من الداخل، وهذا يعطينا الخوف ويربي فينا الخوف والقلق. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is the one that is responsible for the da'wah, the one that protects it and the one that guides it. But we worry about the destruction of the community that comes from within itself. This brings us a fear, without a doubt. We reached a stage of massive growth in the Muslim community when it comes to institutions, brick and mortar. But when it comes to the actual maturity of an institution, we fail in that regard gravely. And I'm called to reflect upon, after 20 years or so, with the disappearance of the central role that was there in the African American community, the central role that was played in the da'wah specifically. We saw many imams that were community leaders. We had a different model of what an imam meant. There was such a push on the part of some to move towards a board-centered masjid. And it looked like it was a great idea, and it was a board-centered masjid based upon a collective of individuals of different backgrounds coming in. And up to now, we fail to see professionality and organization that is equal to the education that many of the professionals have. For whatever reason or another, we haven't been able to overcome that difficulty. And our masajid, instead of being stable centers, have become places of internal destruction, places of whimsical politics, capricious decision-making, harmful outlooks and practices that have created in our community a culture where now we find constant lawsuits and we find internal bickering in the masajid to a point where they're no longer stable and the role of the masjid is undermined. Because we fail to invest properly in imams are not vested in communities properly. And so we have this constant tension between imams and masjid administrations, to the point where the imam is not a leader, but is an employee which is subject to the whim of a community that doesn't know what direction is going in and doesn't have the capacity to address its issues. A community which is just focused on its economic pursuits and is imploding on every level: mental health, addiction, divorce, and any of the other major issues that emerge that lead to family breakdown, such as cultural practices which stagnate the community. There comes a point in time that we learn from the prophets alayhimus salam, that we have to retreat from communities which are in a trajectory of self-implosion. Not because we don't want to fulfill our responsibility, but because we find ourselves in a situation in which the people themselves, they fight us because of our love of the community, in our devotion to the community, in our commitment to the community, all of which they don't have. And they will never have, because they will put their personal interests before commitment to the community. And that's where we lack a concept of true leadership. So we have to really think deeply about what this means. We don't put ourselves on the level of prophets because of our failures and the reality that we will never equal prophethood. Isma or infallibility is only to those whom Allah gives. And we know that in our belief as Muslims, we can say with certainty that we believe that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the seal of the prophets, and prophethood ends with the Prophet ﷺ. But we learn from the prophets that there's a time when a community is on a trajectory of destruction and there is no heeding of the call and the message, then we have to retreat and look on how to reform ourselves and look at how to strategize and regroup on other fronts. Yesterday, two brothers involved in da'wah told me that they were pretty much pushed out of their ability to function in the community. And actually, three brothers told me, almost back to back. Two at the end of the day and one at the beginning of the day. And I myself confronted a similar situation, being terminated without any real justification. And so what I look at is, how long will we continue on this spiral effect, the cyclical path to just implosion? We, especially those of us who are not born into Islam, in many ways we have a different trajectory than those who were born into Islam. We almost have to let those aspects of the community that don't want to grow implode. And they will implode. It may not be in our lifetime, but we have to work on those fronts in which we can be productive. We can't submit ourselves to the toxicity, because what that does is it begins to impact our iman. And what it does is it pushes people to the haram. And what it does is it pushes people away from the deen. What it does is it makes people bitter. What it does is it makes people lose hope. What it does is make some even leave the deen. And they could have been from the people that were committed to da'wah. We see it over and over again. We've seen it, especially within the last 70 years or so. People that were heavily committed to the da'wah, they end up leaving because of the toxicity that is in the community across cultures. And people, they think that they're serving the community, but in reality, they're not serving the community. They're bringing more and more harm to the community. And what is extremely problematic is that when we begin to address these issues, it's labeled as opening the door to fitna. When the reality of the situation is that we're embroiled, we're immersed, we're suffocating because of the fitna of the way that the community already is. So if we speak with the intention of reform because of going through the fire itself and experience. This is not just a conversation that comes from the sideline. This is not just a conversation that comes from the sideline. And so we have to really understand that we're at a point where many are burning out. We're at a point where communities themselves are locked. And they're locked in such a way that they can't be able to function. So what I tell brothers right now, we need a whole new program. Don't run. Don't retreat from the struggle. Run and retreat from the reality of the toxicity and confront the struggle that we have before ourselves. The struggle that we have before ourselves is to develop new models of sustainability in the da'wah, independent of the toxicity that is containing our ability to grow, and remove ourselves away from people that are not going to address our issues, right? We come from poverty, so we shouldn't fear poverty. If we come from poverty, we know how to deal with poverty. So the issue that only is before us is growth, because we understand what it means to bottom out. What we need to look at and what we need to deal with is our own stability, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and create support systems around ourselves, and then to look at our economic development. There's been many models that have been presented in the non-Muslim community, which we would do very well to study and to understand in order to be able to move forward. We have to move out of that box of how it has to be in the process of ABC in order for it to be correct, and open up our minds and ask Allah for guidance and seek out the knowledge of the principles, especially of the deen, that are going to allow us on this new journey. But we can't commit to the same old. If we commit to the same old, we're done. Because many of these communities are imploding. They're imploding in their families, they're imploding on the individual level, they're imploding administratively, they're imploding even in their ability to address the problems that are in the environments in which they exist. And so if that's the case, that means that they're isolating themselves from those environments in which they exist. And the more that they isolate themselves from those environments that they exist, those environments will take over in one way or another. And so money is not going to shield many of these communities, because they end up fighting over who decision makes. They end up fighting over the money. They end up mismanaging all kinds of things that come from people that are not organized, and people that are not having a sound vision, and people that lack leadership. So what we have to do is do the opposite of what's done. Become more organized, become more strategic, become more motivated, become more hopeful, become more collaborative. And we cannot undermine the value of going back to our people. If we go back to our people, and when I say go back to our people, we're talking about the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, he went to his people. His people were not Muslims. Some of the biggest supporters of the deen in the beginning of the da'wah were people like Abu Talib, were people like Najashi. We see examples of where it is that people that were not Muslims supported the deen. And so we have to go back to our communities. And I'm speaking directly to the Black and the Latino community. And we have to align ourselves with our people, and I keep saying this. And we have to align ourselves with them, and they themselves will see the beauty of Islam and support. It's something that we've seen time and time again, because we have something to offer. But the more we isolate ourselves from our people, the more that we look down on them. That's what we learn from every other community, to look down on our own people. The more that we destroy our ability to do da'wah, the more that we destroy our ability to collaborate and cooperate, the more that we undermine ourselves. Because at the end of the day, what we have in North America is a constant struggle for who is going to lead and who is going to control these institutions. And at the end of the day, I'll leave you with this. I was dealing with a Puerto Rican brother recently, last night, and he was crying to me. And he was telling me, and the brother's homeless, and he was telling me, I'm really looking for a home. I'm really looking for a masjid. But I come to this place and I feel that I'm pushed out, because I see that people look at me, and the way they look at me like I don't belong. They look at me as though I'm going to cause them harm. They look at me and they make me feel unwanted. That's the reality of our people. We don't have the ability to address their situation on economic level. We don't make them feel comfortable on the mental, spiritual level. And we don't have the ability to counsel them in such a way that any lesson of deed will be practical to them to deal with what it is that they're going through. If a person is telling you, I lack shelter, then that means they're going to struggle with food. And if they lack shelter and food, that means emotionally they're not going to be in a good place. And if they lack shelter and food and emotional stability, where do you think they're going to be at when it comes to spiritual stability? Yes, they may have dua. Yes, they may have faith and so on and so forth. But the brother asked me, I'm looking for you, O Allah. He said, I'm looking for you, Allah. He said, why is it that this is happening to me? He said, I don't feel like living. Then we don't have the ability to address people's situations when they're in that state. The Prophet ﷺ, we find is one of the first things that he did when the Muhajirun went to Medina was to ensure that they had shelter, to ensure that they had support before building the masjid. And what do we think about the principles of da'wah before we start talking to people about tawheed and how it is that they should conduct themselves? If we're not meeting the needs of the people when they have the right of sadaqah, if you don't want to say that they have the right of zakat because of whatever position that you take, even if you say that the angle of mu'allafat al-qulub is not applicable to the non-Muslims, but from the angle of sadaqah, there's nothing that bar or prevent or prohibit us from helping a human being with sadaqah. We, at that level, are not even supported. And at this point, then we have to ask ourselves, how are we doing better than what the Nation of Islam did? The Nation of Islam came into these communities and created an environment that allowed the deen to eventually spread. And many of those people came out of whatever it is that they were committed to in terms of their habits and their problems. And even some of them left what were the practices of the Nation of Islam and they became Sunnis. But what we're seeing now is that people are becoming Muslims that are Sunnis and they want to leave Islam because they don't find the guidance and the orientation. This is a communal problem when the youth don't want to practice Islam. It's not just the converts. This is the communal problem when people go through struggles that they can't handle, they end up wanting to leave the deen. So what we see before us is a serious crisis. And what I tell the brothers that are involved in da'wah, let it implode. Let it implode. Let them continue to deal with the struggles because they don't want to commit to address the struggle. Let them implode and you build elsewhere. And you continue and you take it step by step. The da'wah doesn't always have to be institutional. The da'wah can be one-on-one. But make sure that you're okay. Make sure that your family is stable. Because this is a community which does not support dua. This is a community which does not support the dua. This is not a community which wants to support the da'wah the way that it needs to be supported. There's no other religious community in which the religious leadership is questioned and tormented and undermined to such an extent as it is in the Muslim community. So there's a sign that they don't want the symbols of the deen to manifest themselves. They don't want to invest in the people. The very community itself doesn't want to invest in their imams and their mashaykh and for the da'wah to be done and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, when that is what is taking place, don't put yourself in harm's way. Increase yourself and retreat for a little bit. Imam Ahmad, rahmatullahi alayhi, at one point in time, he fell into hardship. So he had to go to Yemen and he ended up just learning the same ahadith that he was learning until there was a time period where Allah Ta'ala opened the door for him. And we know historically that most of the people that were involved heavily in da'wah, they were ending up in situations of persecution and hardship. And I'm not saying that we should follow suit with that and just say, well, it's just the way. It's not just the way. What we should do is make sure that we strategize to secure ourselves so that the da'wah can be on a firm foundation for the future. But what we're doing is we're making these positions of da'wah to our children look like backward choices in life. And what we're doing is making it seem that the more that we're committed to the deen, the more that it means our own destruction. What we're doing is we're showing that the masjid is no longer a place of refuge, but is a place of fitna, is a place of turmoil, it's a place with no leadership, with no guidance, with no direction, with no ability to respond to our needs. And when that is the case, people, that is the biggest act of bid'ah that can take place when we destroy the houses of Allah Ta'ala and we undermine leadership. That's the biggest destruction. And when leadership itself doesn't invest, is not invested in, and it doesn't invest in developing itself so that it can meet the needs of the people. See what I'm saying? But the people themselves don't even know what their needs are. And so what you have is fights over how zakat money and sadaqah money is going to be spent by people that are not committed to even understand the people's problems. So everybody's playing Khalifa. Everybody's playing Khalifa. But what we don't want to play is the role of serving the community. And so we call on you, let it implode, let it implode, let it implode, and let's rebuild. Because the faster that it implodes, the faster that it will be for us to be able to get on with the work that we need without having the obstacles. They're imploding already. They're imploding from every angle. You understand what I'm saying? But our job is to teach the people and keep the hope alive and be examples of love and brotherhood and mercy, and teach the people in a way which builds community, which doesn't destroy community, and teach the people that we have to sacrifice and we have to commit and we have to learn how to consult each other, and we have to learn how to be people of our word, and we have to learn how to look out for each other, and we have to learn that if we're not building for the deen, then what's left except destruction. Assalamu alaikum.